Hello, beautiful people. As you know, you have been reading your Other Words from Home text, Applying Critical Lens. And last week we applied one lens, and this week we're going to essentially not completely disregard what we were studying before, but we're going to think about it like trying on a new pair of glasses, a completely different lens that we're going to singularly look through as we read the next section of our book. So the lens that we're going to try on this week is called the gender lens. And there's some pre-knowledge that we need to understand before we go into reading and applying this lens. The gender lens means when reading through a gender lens, we ask you, the reader, to consider whether or not the concept of gender/gender roles is represented fairly, in your opinion, in the book you're reading. First, we must consider our own basic understanding. The definition of gender from Merriam-Webster.com, and there are several definitions, but I felt like the one that pertains specifically to this was the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one's biological sex, which is male, female, and obviously we can go into much further conversation. That is a beautiful conversation, and I'm constantly always understanding even more about the difference between gender and sex. But there's a great video that I'd love for you to watch before you go on. And it's located in the learning slides where you found this video just above it. That's essentially this, it's a little kiddish, but I really like actually the production quality of it. And I like how it is just a really basic way to understand the definition of gender, how it is absolutely associated with, but it is a slightly-ish different concept/meaning to a person's biological sex. And so I think that it's really awesome to educate yourself on the textbook definition of what gender is and what the biological sex of a person is. It helps perhaps with your understanding to know this because we're really diving into specifically talking about gender and how it's represented and not a person's biological sex, but it's impossible to disconnect the two. They are entirely connected in a way, meaning they're entirely related when you're thinking about one versus the other. Our opening questions are, what are some, and this just means think about them in your mind, you don't have to write them down, but what are some characteristics you assign each gender, and each meaning there isn't, there's a gender spectrum, there's obviously there's just lots of information out there about gender and gender identity, and there are so many testimonies out there about gender, and especially people talking about their own experience/epiphanies they might have about gender as they develop or as they are around others and learn more about other people's gender identities. Just what are some characteristics that you assign each in your mind? Did you grow up with specific stereotypes? Like when you think of the female gender, do you specifically think of jobs that you immediately think are more female job stereotypes? Or do you think of specific like emotional or physical stereotypes that you associate with the female gender or the male gender? Or obviously there's the concept of non-binary identity as well. So what stereotypes exist? Which ones do you feel like you see happen quite a bit in your life and you struggle not subscribing to that stereotype? Which stereotypes about gender have you challenged in your life, if not out loud to other people, but maybe just mentally you've questioned stereotypes that exist around gender? What are your own personal truths when it comes to gender? Knowing that we are constantly evolving, which is a good thing. We are constantly evolving beings. And so our understanding of other people's experiences is constantly evolving. So the way that we understand things and the way that we see truth absolutely can be the same and stay the same for a long time. It can also evolve, right? So we have to understand how we think and how we see the concept of gender and understand ourselves as we are readers before we go into judging how a person represents gender in their writing. Our ideas about gender are constructed, meaning they are built up. Like when we're talking nature versus nurture, I'm specifically talking about the more nurture part, the ideas that are in our mind because of images, because of movies we see, because of the way people talk to us, because of toy advertisements, because of, when I was growing up, commercials were everything. I think they still are, but I know with streaming and stuff, commercials and what we are if anything, you sometimes are a more targeted audience because of what you're watching. And so our ideas about gender are constructed by seeing and hearing multiple similar images and conversations over and over and over again. And so many of our constructed ideas about what is a truth about something is because we've just seen it a million times. And so we interpret things to be truths until maybe we either cement it in our mind or we disrupt that truth because we feel that it's not fair or fairly represented. So when we use a critical lens, it helps us deconstruct, meaning not completely just argue and disagree with, but it helps us pick it apart and say, should I just believe everything I'm hearing? Kind of like with the youth lens that you did last week, right? Is the representation of this gender fair in my mind? What hidden messages about this gender am I kind of like subliminally supposed to believe, or should I catch on to because of the way the author is crafting this specific character I'm analyzing? What stereotypes perhaps are being perpetuated? And I wrote on the screen, also note that in alliance with the term gender is the the two words gender roles, which the Oxford English Dictionary defines as the role or behaviors learned by a person as appropriate to their gender, determined by the prevailing cultural norms, right? So we have these gender roles, and of course, cultural norms is important to pick out because cultures are not all the same, right? And that can be microcultures, that can be big cultures, like the culture of a country, as opposed to the culture of like a subculture, like my 7th grade class, right? So when we dive into our next part of reading Other Words for Home, the questions you're going to ask yourself are a lot like the other lenses, but they have to do with gender. You're going to ask yourself, how does the author, meaning Jasmine Warga, represent the character's gender directly? How do we know this person associates as a female or a male or non-binary? How does the author represent the character's gender indirectly? What can we infer Jasmine Warga believes about that gender because of the way that she has crafted that character? For instance, if she was to write, or if your author was to write female people that identify as the female gender as super whiny and shallow people, does that mean that Jasmine Warga wants us to believe that about females? I mean, we subliminally are kind of being constructed in our mind that that is the truth because of that's how. And question 3 is kind of the follow-up. Do you feel as if that is a fair representation of how you see that in real life? Do you feel that's an accurate representation given your specific perspective? In other shows or books, do people particular with this particular gender act the same way as they do in this book, kind of a text-to-text relationship? So how do you apply this to your Other Words from Home next step? You're going to open up in the learning slides where you found this video, the Gender Lens work document found in the 70 learning slides in lesson 3. And you're going to make your own copy just like you did last week with the Youth Lens. And you're going to use your learning from this video and from the other video to apply the questions to apply that gender lens and those questions to your reading of the next section, which is page 177 to 254. Now that you have the doc out and open, read over those questions, have them in your mind alongside the discussion guide. Annotate as you read. Text evidence is always requested when applicable. You share this document with your literacy teacher when you are done, and if you have any questions, or if you feel there is anything that we've left out of this lesson, or if there's any sort of ways that you'd like to expand on any of this stuff, this is your platform to talk about how you see gender represented in this book, fairly or unfairly. Email us with any questions. Happy learning, folks. Bye.